thanks so much for these two very beautiful presentations that had so much in common, even if, of course, the departing points were extremely different and extremely different approaches. I'll try to connect a bit the two, but also I would like to, like before, to open the floor to questions that can also elaborate more on how these practices have a lot in common. One thing that Sven has already mentioned when, for instance, Farid was talking about maintenance as part of the work, and now, for instance, this awareness, this acknowledgement is already something that goes into the direction of understanding an infrastructural awareness of how you can appropriate, how you can use an institution and not go into this institutional activism, as Caterina Diegot beautifully framed. No? And now it is urgent to practice forms of institutional activism, to take care of the institutions and to use them, appropriate them opportunistically and not, but to turn them into meaningful places of production of knowledge and not only. So I wanted to maybe start a bit with Farid. When you said, when you analyzed the figure of Kartini, at some point I had a question in my mind: would Kartini be an artist today? Would Kartini be working with ruangrupa today if she was living in Jakarta?
She died too young.
That's for sure.
But maybe, yeah, I don't know. Maybe she's too. If she's as a member of us, I think she would propel us to somewhere even more radical, gender-wise, yeah, because we're not that radical gender-wise. Actually, I'm trying to make an argument there that we're answering it differently, but there are certain stuff that we cannot untangle yet, which going to superstructure as well, or maybe it's like in the jokes, we joke a lot, and then some people actually saw us, put a distance to us because of the thing that they cannot get into the jokes. So I don't know whether Kartini would like our jokes. Because the way she writes, it's too, for me, there are too many problems, you know, to joke around in her life. That is not the case with us. There are too many problems that we couldn't actually do anything about, so we joke, you know.
Of course, my question was to point out the idea that, you know, like somebody like Kartini was very much engaged in processes of social change in a time when that was a privilege that only certain people could exercise, and how much perhaps, you know...
That's true. Yeah,
a practice like yours or like many other practices are busy with this kind of understanding of the role of the artist in a society, but you know it's without the privilege. No, so most of the times, or privilege needs to be renegotiated every time within strategies. So, and my question to Sven, and of course, like it's also going back to the initial questions of the symposium. So how do you organize difference, no? And where do you see, for instance, in this kind of understanding of how a superstructure can be the content of this institutional activism? Where do you see a common ground? Is it in the undercommons, as you pointed out in a
well, yeah, I mean, the question I think for me is indeed, one question would be, to what extent do you actually create groups, networks, you know, organizations that sort of privilege commonality over the organization of difference, right? I mean, there's a clear tension there. How can you actually organize difference so that you create a common ground to some extent and you don't have to agree on everything? How do you deal with privilege indeed? I mean, as you know, you may be totally precarious within an art world or academic context, but you're still super privileged, you know, vis-a-vis you know, someone who desperately needs, you know, asylum or whatever. How indeed does this become articulated in, for instance, you know, a project that we could maybe mention at least briefly is the New World Academy that Jonas Staal has been doing with BAK, in which, for instance, also one session or one project was with the We Are Here refugee collective, which was in part, if I get the structure right, was sort of closed workshops behind doors to really elaborate a proposal for a certain type of accommodations, or even you might say institution where refugees could live but also work. And this was then presented publicly within the main exhibition space at BAK, where in a sort of custom built and designed setting, and there it was presented and discussed publicly. So there there is a process, a collaborative process that results in a proposal which is then shown, presented, discussed, etc., and where it can be further then challenged. I mean, I remember that, for instance, I think Tanja Bugera also had some very critical questions at the time. So, it's not one, let's say, Gedankengegenstand that is then presented without, sort of any further discussion, but it then, in a sense, initiates the second phase, the next phase, when it has this, you might say, superstructural expression.
And it's also perhaps also this idea that we were touching upon before of like losing certain privileges to be the one as the artist to come to with a full form already, but actually with a form that can be shaped collectively and through a collective work. Before we open to questions, when again the same questions were more about related to organizing difference, also because the practice of the ruangrupa position itself in a territory like the Indonesian one that is extremely diverse, dispersed in many different places. I remember the cinema project, for instance, trying to reach all these different places, different contexts. So how did you, with this kind of projects and others, try to organize differences, and by differences, of course, meaning different constituencies, but also different problems, through a project that was maybe discussed, as you said, in Jakarta, being the place that inform you and keep you together and troubles you and so on?
I think first we start from a position that we cannot do anything, We cannot do everything, I mean, like anything as well. We couldn't paint, we couldn't do, like artistically, we cannot do anything. But so we kind of like, sometimes we joke that we make friends more than art, So that kind of stuff we do all the time as well. The result or maybe catching up on Sven's stuff, content versus platform, like both of them are actually like running in simultaneously for us. Like how we find that actually a cinema card could happen in Indonesia at that moment, taking your example. Just because of there was an opportunity, there was an interest, and then we figure out as a medium that it actually kind of like as an answer to what we're trying to answer. So it's of course not always like that, but like market as well, like we've created market several times, including like it started with the celebration of the big Muslim Day as a critic, because everyone was like consuming so much at that moment, and then we kind of like one part of it while making it an alibi of researching towards it, but then it has a life in its own after that it's like it kind of like asks us to take it somewhere else, so using
ideology.
Yeah, and then ideology, all those kind of stuff, it's never fixed as well. It's kind of difficult, and I think like hearing you present is kind of like, it's really helpful for me who has been trying to try to understand what we are undergoing through. So reflection like that it's kind of like a luxury for us. So it's good. Thanks for the opportunity, at least for that. And then we can ask, maybe open it.
So we're taking questions officially from now. Ellen, please.
My question is about the kind of content of infrastructural critique versus this idea that you said, Sven, of articulated form, and how in the Undercommons they talk about the naming of a politics as already one kind of enclosure, right? So even to name, to identify, to whatever. So I think this idea of articulated form is important. It relates to my presentation, I guess. But at the same time, that can't be a content. So I guess I'm just wondering how. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's in a sense we return to very tried and also problematic sort of modernist aesthetic concepts, like the whole form-inhalt dichotomy, form-content. So indeed, what is content ultimately? I mean, content needs to be formed. It needs to be informed. So perhaps one could think of content in terms of indeed certain sort of ideologies of certain notions that have a kind of meme-like status that then need to be structured by being informed precisely in being filtered, let's say, through social practice, right? Through in the case of what we're talking about here, mostly collaborative social cultural praxis. So in a sense, content is precisely nothing. I mean, it's what only attains any degree of reality by being sort of informed through lived practice, I would say. And so you might say that perhaps in some of the projects that ruangrupa develops, maybe content is precisely what is pre-given and what has already, of course, been pre-formed either in sort of dominant ideology and dominant discourse, so having to do with gender and having to do with the division of labor, or it could be it could be something that has a potentially much more critical status. So you could, in a sense, take those letters, published in Dutch originally, and sort of activate them in the present, and make this, take this content out of this sort of form of these letters written in Dutch to her Dutch friends at the time, and give it a kind of actuality in the present by reformatting elements from those letters in the guise of artworks, of events that, of course, go completely beyond her historical and cultural horizon, right?
Any more questions? Joanna?
Yes, I would like to ask Sven about the new institutionalism that happened also in Holland, I don't know, in early 2000. How do you see, if I remember correctly, it was also a social democratic investigation of how an art institution could function, and so how do you see it in relation to your current research of how to regain the institutions in some way?
I suppose you could perhaps see it as a specific historic phase in the development of certain practices, indeed with new institutionalism emerging perhaps at the tail end of a certain social democratic conception of art and art institutions, with the institution becoming more discursive, et cetera, et cetera. And of course you see that at least some of the institutions that were associated with this notion of new institutionalism have also moved on and are now indeed sort of hosting or co-organizing forms of institutional activism. So perhaps the new institutionalism was a certain momentary, fragile consensus, right, at a certain historical point in time, but it was already marked, I think, by an attempt to indeed use, perhaps even instrumentalize the institution. So there I would see the continuity with what we're discussing now.
perhaps these walls that have been moved by Michael Asher, it's also this idea that perhaps artists today are using those walls in new ways, by also when Joanna is one of the co-founders of the Artist Organization International, there was a platform that tried to look at different organizations created by artists, among which the New World Summit of Jonas Stahl, but also Tania Bruguera, the International Migrant Movement, that perhaps is going to be touched upon by Ellen. No, but anyway, maybe it's food for the. It's a little bit, just a little bit, just to say that it's it's definitely also artistic practice, or new forms, new contents are also born out of all these legacies that have left materials to be used. That's how you perhaps engage into a new institutional activism, to go back to it. I think we have time for another question, please.
Hi, thanks very much to you all. Not necessarily a question to this panel alone. I haven't read the book as yet, of course, so it's a bit difficult to respond. But coming here today under this title, I thought of Yates McKee and how he argues that artists participating in Occupy Wall Street had struck out art, partially had left art. So once we were artists in that sense. And I came here with a question of that actually Tom also posed to himself, how we actually formulate a critical response to these kinds of practices. And Sven's, your lovely talk also touched upon these elements. So in the interest of BAK forming a post-academic institution at the interstices between art practices, art institutional practices, artists and theorists, historians, critics, instituting anew. Could you maybe reflect a tiny moment on how the critical, historical, theoretical form can also newly institute?
You mean specifically within the context of such an institute that operates at the interstices of artistic, academic?
BAK has this amazing chance right now, so it's very relevant, I think, what you're debating in relation to that.
No wonder you mentioned BAK in your presentation.
Yeah, no, I mean, sure. The question is, to what extent can you actually create a kind of, transdisciplinary institution, a transversal institution, or, is it? I think there is kind of an asymmetry in that, it is telling that it is BAK, it is an art institution that becomes the basis for that kind of project, and then of course academics become involved, and perhaps various programs become involved. But I, have trouble imagining sort of a university or a university department becoming the basis. I think, in a sense, the real, certainly in Holland, let's say. Germany too. In Germany too, yeah, exactly. So I think there is a real asymmetry here, and there is almost a sense of there is a sense of relief, I think, also among many academics, that structures can be, not necessarily, but it can be somewhat more flexible and somewhat more amenable to actually creating meaningful forms of collaborative labor in the art world than they tend to be in academia.
Echo what you're saying, that as academics we certainly seek out art institutions, but one of the connotations of once we were artists is also that many artists have become academics.
Yeah, no, of course.
They're seeking us out.
Sure, yeah.
Also,
mutual instrumentalization.
And then also in a way it's like, I wonder how we might have a responsibility to go back into universities, to go back into art history departments, to unhinge them. I'm currently not succeeding in that, but I think
Is the only
suspicious.
option indeed to form an undercommons, or are there indeed other possibilities?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know, but we can talk about that later. But I think I am suspicious of the term para-academic, actually, because I think in some ways it's like,
Right.
where does that mean that it's cited? I don't know, like what is its relation? Yeah, so I think it is an important opportunity, but also we can't just leave the institution because there are people still left inside and they can't get out. So
Yes. The prison house
it's true.
of language and of the institution. Yeah.
And I
You
find
painted a very vivid picture now.
Yeah. But I
It's a
think
call
so.
for help.
But just to add to that, because I think BAK is you are at the kind of the edge of a cliff. So you should also direct some of your energy towards like putting pressure on universities on the university system. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree.
And just to comment also on BAK, I think it's interesting how BAK was also able to, I can say it because I was not there yet, so I can say it as an observer, but also learned from artists, by collaborating long term with people like Jonas, but not only with Arno Meek or other artists that were like already fellows to the institution. Also, it's about a learning process of learning from each other and then understanding how this can become a new format for an art institution to not just being opportunistically, as you said, deployed, but actually to foresee that kind of possibility and allow a different infrastructure to exist.
You have inside information.
You have?
What you without it, you have inside information.
Inside information, yes. Going back to the whistleblowers that Joanna was mentioning before. Please, Jonas.
Yes, my question is to Farid. There was, I think, 2 years ago at the Athens Biennial, there was a speech by Stephanie Bailey, an art critic, theorist, and she started by saying, "My name is Stephanie, I'm a neoliberal." But like with the AA meetings, you know, like my name is Jonas, I'm an alcoholic. And I was wondering whether when you ended on your note that maybe you have to become capitalists, you mean something similar in terms of addressing or acknowledging the compromised position of your practice, or if you meant it differently.
I'm still figuring that one out as well. But it's clear that there are certain forces by being in that scale that we cannot dismiss. We don't dismiss anyway to begin with. We're taking a picture as it is. So in general. But then because of we started in one curiosity or actually urgency to cut our dependency from this NGO external foreign funding model, that we have to figure out other ways to exist, and then by that as well, we found out that we actually can answer stuff differently. On like, you know, our interest is kind of different than, let's say, what art is interested in. So in that sense, I think it's a bit sarcastic, of course, to myself, and a warning. Most of the time, it's a warning that we can become like that if we're not careful. But in other sense, it's also like it's inevitable if we want to, like, let's say activist, you know, like what Maria said before, this activist position. We've taken that couple of times already so far, and then it's kind of like frustrating to take that. So because we can protest, but we cannot actually take our protest to a certain level that we can actually be heard, at least in our context. So what can be heard, that's kind of like a shortcut to make real difference. Is what, like, it's very available right now, and it's the door that the easiest to open. Maybe that's the way. If we are talking about in a certain scale of capital scale, then we actually can make a difference in Jakarta, let's say, or if not in Indonesia.
That's what you meant also before when you said the gentrification at our own pace or terms.
Because it will happen anyway.
We're not that strong to avoid it.
Liana?
Yeah, just to go back to Sven's comments about the content that needs to be informed, I was just wondering, because I feel like we're not really talking about the elephant in the room here, which is money. Because this content is very much still informed through a power structure of this infrastructural behavior, either in the academic institution or the art institution. And I mean, if we're talking about the economic base through kind of a Marxist view, of course, the precariat of the art world, and I'm very happy that you started your comment through that, is very much privileged compared to a precariat in a mine, as you mentioned before. But this precariat of the art world still is voiceless, when even in kind of collective structures. So I just wanted your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some attempts, of course, to give it a voice, right? Also with, Carrot Workers Brigade and so on, Precarious Workers Brigade. And, of course, there's been, mostly a debate about sort of the intern economy, I suppose, by others. With, to some extent, the people who are directly involved also being implicated. But yeah, I think I have the feeling that in a way there was a beginning a couple of years ago of actually also more of sort of an organizational drive towards giving various precarious positions a voice. But it kind of seems to have petered out a little bit in recent times. I don't know what people's impressions are. I mean, there wasn't really a movement of building on that, it seems, on sort of the first beginnings. Which of course also has to do with the fact that ultimately you are all, competing with each other. And so it's also hard to organize a way, let's say, those not differences, but those relations of competition, right? So there's, on the one hand, there is a drive towards solidarity and getting organized, but on the other hand, there is really no structure in place comparable to industrial capitalism where it makes sense to unionize because it might still, at least subjectively, make more sense for you to just try to survive as best as possible, and to be this, this neoliberal subject, this self-entrepreneur. So I think there are just massive disincentives, structural disincentives that perhaps prevent a further building of that kind of movement.
We gather some questions. Brian, please.
It's a question for both of you. I still am thinking of, Farid, what you ended on, saying that ruangrupa seems to have come to a kind of an impasse, but the way forward actually seems to be to move into real estate in some capacity, right? But I keep thinking of this alongside the work of Michael Asher, which you were speaking about, Sven, as a kind of as something which architecturally, without the kind of critical overlay, actually starts to mirror many of the forms that we know from gentrification architecture or kind of high austerity, the removal of walls and the exposure of piping and things like this. But this of course opens up a kind of a horror, doesn't it, of where if you move into real estate investment, but then you kind of find that you were already there the whole time in some way, or that Michael Asher was somehow unknowingly or knowingly already there. And I wonder if this consolidation of superstructure and base is something which is something that has happened actually for a long time, that we are only finding the terms or the forms to fully come to terms with.
Sure. And of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, what we're talking about, all these practices, however critical they are, or no matter how radical they are, or maybe in some ways, of course, they're completely, deeply, fundamentally shaped by by, let's say, processes of flexibilization, the neoliberal restructuring of the economy, gentrification, etc. I mean, we are in a sense using all these sort of structures, but also all these transformations of social and economic structures that we're part of anyway. We're using them in a sense as materials. It's almost in a sense, it's the medium we work with. It's the juridical, economic, social medium that we work with. So of course we are in this position of immanence in that sense. And as you say, Michael Escher, on the one hand, you might read this gesture of removing the wall as a critical gesture, and it does away with this division between the back room and the gallery space, and it can be seen as inaugurating a different way of doing things, a different mode, a different type of cultural practice. But this new form of cultural practice is of course also precisely formed and informed, shaped by the developments that have created all these, flexible workspaces where people can sit down for a day with their laptop and, work without having a fixed office or what have you. So of course these developments are, not just running in tandem, but they're ultimately different sides, different articulations of, of one and the same development.
Maria, I think then the last question.
No, I don't have a question. I'd just like to share with you my thoughts.
Sure.
I think that we face a fantastic phenomenon. It's the first time that the political system is fighting with itself. I mean, capitalism against capitalism. And this is something very weird. And also I believe that the artists, they don't belong to any kind of class. I mean, as an artist, even if I come from a middle class, my family is from a middle class family. I don't belong to high class or middle class or low class, nothing. We are without class. So I don't think any kind of precarity situation towards the artist, because we can do whatever we like and we can travesty ourselves the way we like, and we can go from the back door or from the front door. We have a great imagination and we can do whatever we like. This is my idea. And if I would like, let's say, to have a new political system, I would like to give the name liberal communism. This is.
I think on the liberal communism, we closed the curtain for this act. and we have a coffee break.